Hi, I'm Diana Hsieh, the philosopher behind the Rationally Selfish webcast, which happens every week on Sunday morning. And this last week, I answered a question on the alleged inspiration that Ayn Rand drew from 1920s serial killer William Hickman. And unfortunately, there was a kind of internet burp, and so the question didn't record, and so I thought I would re-record a version just for YouTube. So here's the question. Did Ayn Rand draw inspiration from the serial killer William Hickman? I ask due to this article by Mark Ames on Alternet entitled, Ayn Rand, hugely popular author and inspiration to the right-wing leaders, was a big admirer of serial killer. According to the article, Rand idolized the serial killer William Hickman and used him as an inspiration for the lead male characters in her books, notably Howard Roark. Also, Rand is said to seek an environment in which sociopaths like Hickman can thrive. Are these claims true or not? If so, would they affect the validity of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism? So that's the question. Let me give you my basic view first, and then we'll dissect the major claims of this article in detail. First of all, my view, it's just that this article is a moral crime from beginning to end. It is absolute smear without any concern for the truth. The explicit goal from the very first paragraph of the article, which you can see for yourself, is to discredit Ayn Rand due to her influence over American culture and increasing influence over American culture. The leftists here are scared, and facts in this case to these people are not an obstacle. Their supposedly noble ends justify any means, I think. Now, I think it's not possible to write this article honestly, nor to spread it around honestly, as lots of leftists are doing. It's not possible to honestly think that the article is fair to Ayn Rand because it's so clearly a smear job. However, I do think it's possible for an honest person to think that the underlying facts about Ayn Rand's admiration of William Hickman are true. In other words, that there's a kernel of factual truth in the article, and that kernel is really worrisome. And maybe that would turn somebody off from reading Ayn Rand, even if they're actually interested in her. So my goal here with this video is to dispel that worry. So what's the basic claim of the article? Well, it's pretty thin on substance, but I'll quote what amounts to the core claim. Quote, back in the late 1920s, as Ayn Rand was working out her philosophy, she became enthralled by a real-life American serial killer, William Edward Hickman, whose gruesome, sadistic dismemberment of 12-year-old girl named Marion Parker in 1927 shocked the nation. Rand filled her early notebooks with worshipful praise of Hickman. Now, if you want the actual facts for yourself, I would recommend that you simply go read Ayn Rand's journals for herself. It's pages 20 to 48, and in fact, if you really want to know the facts, go read those, and you will see that what Ayn Rand does, what Ayn Rand says in these journal entries, is absolutely nothing like what is portrayed in the article. But let's tackle some of the meat of this. Let's discuss this. And I want to talk about three main points. First, I want to talk about the nature and extent of Ayn Rand's interest in William Hickman. I want to talk about her moral views, and I want to talk about her view of society at the time of writing the journals. So let's start with Ayn Rand's interest in Hickman. First, Ayn Rand was not enthralled. She did not fill notebooks with worshipful praise of William Hickman. Instead, she was interested in the case, as lots of people were at the time. It was the OJ trial of their decade. And so it was mentioned a few times in her notes for a novel that she was planning called The Little Street. Well, what interested Ayn Rand about Hickman? What interested her about the case? Well, it wasn't his crimes. It wasn't the killing and dismembering of a 12-year-old girl. Instead, what Ayn Rand was interested in was that this man, the criminal, was indifferent to the demands of society, that he didn't bow to the conventional standards, that he was willing to be absolutely extreme. So here's what Ayn Rand says in her journals, and notice the emphasis I'm going to give here. These are important points. Quote, the model for the boy, Danny Renahan that is, that's the hero of The Little Street, is Hickman. Very far from him, of course. The outside of Hickman, but not the inside. Much deeper and much more. A Hickman with a purpose, and without the degeneracy. It is more exact to say that the model is not Hickman, but what Hickman suggested to me. Close quote. So note, Rand is saying very far from the actual Hickman, without the degeneracy of the actual Hickman. Now, what's useful here to note is then, okay, so how does Ayn Rand's hero, Danny Renahan, how does he in fact differ from Hickman? Well, in fact, he doesn't have the sadistic degeneracy. What he does is he's in conflict with everybody in the town, and he ends up killing the town pastor. But Danny knows this man to be utterly corrupt, even though he's well regarded by the town. Now, this is not an uncommon plot device, where basically what looks to be perfection by the standards of society is actually deeply depraved. And so what seems to be a crime against that perfection is actually understandable, if not right and moral, given the actual circumstances. So again, this is not like William Hickman. Now, I think it's worth noting here that it's perfectly possible to have what Ayn Rand has here, which is basically a kind of partial admiration of somebody, this includes murders. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. Basically, think about Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. These men performed amazing feats of military conquest, and that ought to be recognized for their military prowess. That ought to be recognized, and maybe they even did some good. Alexander the Great spread Greek civilization all over what would become the Roman Empire and further. But basically you can celebrate that. You can celebrate those slices of things without celebrating the whole person. Now, here's another case that I like even more. The show on Showtime, Dexter. This show is about a murdering serial killer. He is engaging, he's smart, he's funny, you like him, you root for him when he kills his fellow serial killers. This is a bit odd, and yet millions of people have no problem watching and totally enjoying this show. Or a more mild example would be the Thomas Crown Affair, where you're glorifying somebody who is in fact a thief. Right? So basically, it's possible to have this kind of partial admiration for people. But overall, what we need to see here is Ayn Rand didn't have this overall enthrallment. She wasn't worshipfully praising him. She wasn't even interested in his crime. She was interested in a small bit of him, a kind of non-essential thread from what the actual crime was about, and it was for an idea for a fictional story. He suggested something to her. There was a glimmer of something in him that she thought, oh, maybe that's interesting. She didn't have to like the whole of him in order to see that. And it's clear, I should mention, it's clear that she didn't like the whole of him. So second point is that William Hickman represents Ayn Rand's immature morality, and it's a morality that she later rejected in her published novels. So Ayn Rand, in her journal, she quotes Hickman as saying, "I am like the state. What is good for me is right." And then she goes on to say, quote, "Even if he wasn't big enough to live by that attitude, he deserves credit for saying it so brilliantly. There is a lot that is purposelessly, senselessly horrible about him. But that does not interest me. I want to remember his actions and characteristics that will be useful for the boy in my story." Close quote. So we see again here, Ayn Rand is noting that Hickman's crimes are purposelessly, senselessly horrible. They're not of interest to her. She's only focused on what will serve her story, what the little bits of overlap might be with her hero, Danny Renahan. But undoubtedly, in this quote, "I am the state, what is good for me is right," there is definitely a bit of Nietzschean Superman here, where where something is right just because it's chosen by the self, or because the self is a big, grand person. But this is not Ayn Rand's mature philosophy. Ayn Rand rejected that kind of personal subjectivism in favor of a fact-driven, rational egoism. So we see this in her fiction, the fiction that she actually published. Gail Wynand is a clear repudiation of Nietzschean quest for power. So basically what she realized is that seeking power over other people makes you their slave. In contrast, the true egoist, like Howard Roark, he's focused on facts. He doesn't care what other people want or don't want. And for Rand, and she says this explicitly in some of her philosophical writings, it's just as wrong to choose something because everybody likes it as it is to reject it because everybody doesn't like it. The rebel, in other words, is just another kind of conformist. And this is one of the points that the extoller of "I am like the state, what is good for me is right," the extoller of that kind of view doesn't get. They're still defining themselves by other people. Now, Howard Roark is indifferent to people. This is true, but it's only in certain ways. It's not the way of the sociopath, where he's not willing to use and abuse to get whatever he wants. No, nothing like that ever happens in The Fountainhead. Howard Roark protects and helps his friends. He helps people like Stephen Mallory and Gail Wynand. He goes to great lengths to help them. He's kind to Peter Keating, and I would say, and I think he would say at the end, he was too kind. Heck, he's even reasonably polite to Ellsworth Toohey. He was out to destroy him. But we do have, and I will mention also the big explosion that happens at the end. Howard Roark makes a big effort to make sure nobody is hurt, and he does that because that is in fact his property by right. Now it's true, Howard is indifferent to people in one delimited sense. In the sense that he is his own man. He's focused on his own goals. He goes by his own perception of reality, and he's not concerned with pleasing others. He's not concerned with rebelling against them. He's not concerned with conforming them. He's after the facts. He's out to build what he judges to be right, and it's fully and completely his judgment. That's the way in which Howard Roark is indifferent to other people. Now, it's worth mentioning here that Ayn Rand's mature ethics includes a code of very demanding virtues like honesty and justice and integrity. And that's because living, flourishing, surviving, being happy requires living in accordance with the facts of reality, living in accordance with abstract principles that encapsulate how you actually survive and flourish. And of course, in her basic sketch of Little Street, Danny Renahan doesn't exemplify that code, but the characters in her published novels do. Howard Roark does, John Galt does, Hank Rearden does, Dagny Taggart does. These are people who live by this demanding code of fact-based virtues, as opposed to the idea that, well, I want it, so therefore it's right, therefore it's good. So that's the second point. Basically, Ayn Rand's interest in William Hickman represents an immature view of morality that she later rejected, as we can in fact see in her fiction and philosophical works. So now let's turn to a third point. It's a related point. Basically, the only other source of Ayn Rand's interest in the Hickman case was the social reaction against Hickman. But, interestingly, this was once again an immature view of hers, and it was rejected as she gained more experience in America. So in her journals, Ayn Rand writes, quote, "The first thing that impresses me about the case is the ferocious rage of the whole society against one man. No matter what the man did, there is always something loathsome in the virtuous indignation and mass hatred of the majority." Close quote. Now at this time, Ayn Rand is clearly disgusted with ordinary people. In this story, we see that most people in the story, basically other than the hero and a semi-heroine, they're common, they're petty, they're low. Now, Ayn Rand eventually rejected that view because she discovered that people in America are in fact not like that. That ordinary people in America are not like ordinary people in Russia that she knew growing up until she emigrated. And in fact, what we see is, particularly over time, she developed a profound and deep appreciation for ordinary, hardworking people in America. And this is seen in her novels. This is represented in her novels time and time again. So in The Fountainhead, you don't just have the wonderful character of Mike the electrician, who is a good and steadfast friend of Howard Roark, but we also see that in the courtroom scene, the second courtroom scene that is, Howard Roark puts his life in the hands of ordinary people. And I just want to read you this paragraph because it's so great. These are not the Ubermensch that Roark is appealing to for judgment. Ayn Rand writes, 12 men sat in the jury box. They listened, their faces attentive and emotionless. People had whispered that it was a tough-looking jury. There were 2 executives of industrial concerns, 2 engineers, a mathematician, a truck driver, a bricklayer, an electrician, a gardener, and 3 factory workers. The impaneling of the jury had taken some time. Roark had challenged many talesmen. He had picked up these 12. The prosecutor had agreed, telling himself that this is what happened when an amateur undertook to handle his own defense. A lawyer would have chosen the gentlest types, those most likely to respond to an appeal to mercy. Roark had chosen the hardest faces. Now, I love that. Now, Roark is looking for his kind of people, which are not Nietzschean supermen who are beyond good and evil, but rather regular people, people who are schooled in the facts of life and hard-working at their jobs, rather than people who are immersed in a fog of feelings and only care what their neighbor think. And then also we see, this is not the only time we see this respect for ordinary people. In Atlas Shrugged, we have the characters of Eddie Willers and Cheryl Taggart and the wet nurse, none of whom are grand industrialists. And my favorite, though, is all the scenes with the railroad workers, who Dagny and Ayn Rand clearly respects enormously. Now, what we do see, so the question is, well, who does Ayn Rand have contempt for? And it's almost exclusively for the intellectuals and other leaders in the novel. These are the people who are corrupt. They ought to know better, and they're responsible for bringing the world into the state of disaster that it's in. Now, Ayn Rand later explained this view of hers, that basically there's a big disconnect between America's intellectuals on one hand, who are substantially corrupt, and America's regular people who are not. This is in the essay Don't Let It Go in Philosophy, Who Needs It? And so if you want to see, was Ayn Rand an elitist? Is this her general view that she has contempt for people, she's willing to crush anybody underfoot who is not her Nietzsche Übermensch? Go read this essay and see what kind of respect she has for ordinary folks. So that's the third point here, basically, that Ayn Rand rejected the view of society on which the little street is based, and that's evident in her later works, her later novels, her later philosophical essays. But I think ultimately, in fact, the distance that Ayn Rand has between herself, her mature work, and the little street is in the fact that this work was never written. It was never published. But let's suppose you never knew this. Let's suppose you thought that this was a book that was part of Ayn Rand's published repertoire. Well, there's a couple other facts you might want to remember. Here, Ayn Rand was only 23. Now, let me guess, you might have believed and or done some not-so-smart things when you were 23. Do you think that maybe she would have qualified her remarks here? In addition, these are private journals. They were not intended by her for publication. And even though she is remarkably clear in them about what she admires in Hickman versus not, she might have been either unwilling or reluctant to publish them, or have wanted to say more on that score, as in fact the introductory comments by the editor do. So basically, though, I think that the article is not just this kind of unjust smear. I mean, I think it's appalling for somebody to claim that there's a connection between Hickman and Ayn Rand's mature philosophy. But I also think it's just downright lazy. Now, if the author of this article or his fans want to argue against Ayn Rand, argue against her mature, published philosophic views. It's possible to do that. It really is. I mean, I'm not going to agree with it personally, but hey, it's not me that's judging right and wrong. You can appeal to your own audience. It's possible to be a bright and honest critic of Ayn Rand's ideas. But that's not what we're seeing here. It's just a completely ridiculous smear. And I actually think this is one of the worst smears. I mean, for decades, we've had all the smears that were spawned by her former lover, Nathaniel Branden, and his wife, Barbara, and their very dishonest accounts of their life with Ayn Rand. And now it's just somebody dug up some new fodder and is twisting it yet again against her. How about focusing on her ideas? Make a philosophical argument, bud. So we might ask, though, well, why is this done as a mere smear? I mean, why not engage the philosophical argument? Well, I think that this whole article is honestly, it's a massive case of projection. There is an utter lack of concern for basic moral standards like honesty and fairness in the article. The basic attitude is, we hate Ayn Rand's ideas, and so we're going to do anything to discredit her, in the hopes that people are going to ignore her and reject her. Now, that's a real pathology. You want to talk about pathological psychology, that's it. That kind of dishonesty. And I think that basically in the minds of people who are hard left in this extremely dishonest way, that basically the supposed nobility of their collective ends justify whatever means they can pull out of their hat. Now, it's worth mentioning, you just can't overlook that this is the stuff, this the ends justify the means, is exactly the stuff of which mass graves are made. And we've seen this time and time again with, in fact, the beloved heroes of this very same hard left. Che, of Mao, of Castro, and even Stalin. So really, I think that the authors of this article and the fans are engaged in a massive act of projection. They're the ones who are lacking any kind of moral standards here, who think that it's right just because it's done in the name of a good cause. And they're the ones who need to rediscover what morality is. So I do want to mention in answer to the final two questions, was Ayn Rand concerned to create a world in which sociopaths like serial killers could flourish? Of course not. Go look at her politics. These people would be locked up forever. She believed in individual rights. Go read Man's Rights. Go read The Nature of Government. And then, does this affect objectivism? Well, of course, absolute lies and fabrications about Ayn Rand can't affect the merits of Ayn Rand's philosophy. But again, objectivism and any philosophy deserves to be judged on its merits, not based on psychologizing about its author. So, in conclusion, to wrap up here, I just want to offer a challenge to the honest folks on the left here. Spend some time studying Ayn Rand's ideas. Make sure that you really understand them well. And then offer some criticisms based on those ideas. Be careful. Be fair. It really won't hurt too much for you to act that way, for you to approach criticism of the philosophy that way, than in the way that the author of this alternate article did. Thanks, everybody.